I'd like to introduce Professor Jon Zelner, and maybe given that we are sort of short on time, I'll keep his introduction short. He's an expert in spatiotemporal patterns of infectious disease and social processes, and particularly he's done a ton of work on respiratory pathogens, and now more recently, done a lot of work on COVID over the last year. And so I think maybe I'll pass it to Jon.
Great. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me to be here today. And it's great to follow Bramar's talk. And it's nice to be in the middle of this kind of very comprehensive lineup that's kind of giving us a rundown of the various and sundry issues that we've been facing over the last, I would say, year, but it's more than that, unfortunately, at this point. And we're obviously still facing these things down. So, I'm going to pivot to talking a little bit more about some domestic issues, particularly within Michigan, with respect to the COVID-19 crisis, and particularly thinking about issues of equity in COVID infection and mortality in Michigan. So the kind of broad question, that's in the title of the talk is, how should we use epidemiological models to address infection inequality? I think I'm going to try and take a corner off of this question today in this talk, but obviously, this is a big, difficult thing to answer, and this is something that myself and my research group have really been, sort of chipping away at slowly and hope to continue to in the months and years to come. So, just as a brief agenda, what I'm hoping to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to first talk briefly about some of the drivers of the just absolutely enormous disparities, particularly by race, in COVID-19 mortality in Michigan, particularly during those first months of the pandemic, so that March to June 2020 period. And then we'll zoom in on some work that we've been doing more recently, looking at whether and how the picture of disparities in Michigan has changed since March of 2020. And then, if we have time, kind of thinking a little bit more about what any of this means for the future. So before I get started, it should go without saying that everything I'm going to talk about is the product of just a huge group effort, as so many of these projects have been. I think all of us have been just kind of blown away by the ability of everybody here at U of M and our external collaborators, for example, in Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, to really come together and do the best that we can in the midst of this, incredibly trying situation. So why is it important to talk about modeling in the context of disparities? So when I think about what it means to be an epi modeler and to kind of model data, I think of that with a kind of a wide lens, where what we're really trying to say is, let's come up with a mathematical and theoretical way of understanding what's actually happening mechanistically in the data. And I think that's always important, but it's particularly critical when we're thinking about racial disparities. So why is that, right? So we know that race itself is a social construct, and it's not a modifiable factor. It's not something that's addressable by policy and intervention, because it's really a reflection of a complex cluster of social and economic and historical forces. And when we focus on race alone in this kind of abstract way as some kind of causal variable, this often leads to the types of behavioral and genetic explanations that we want to avoid, and that kind of litter the history of infectious disease epidemiology and medical science on the whole. And so what I really want to kind of draw your attention to are the kinds of material explanations that lead to the types of inequality that we've seen. There's also some research that indicates that when we racialize risk in the way that it often has been during the pandemic, this can be stigmatizing and can lead to further neglect, right? Just saying that there are racial disparities doesn't make them go away. And depending on your political or social motivation, it might actually encourage people to ignore these. And finally, this often obscures the mechanisms that are actually underlying these disparities, right? Is it residential and occupational segregation? What is it that is actually driving these outcomes? These are the things that we care about. So what you can see on this slide is a screenshot from this website called covidmapping.org, which my research group has developed in collaboration with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And we were asked to do this back in April of 2020, which feels like a lifetime ago at this point. But essentially what we've been doing is mapping the distribution of COVID-19 cases throughout the state over time. So this has given us a kind of close-up look at what's going on. And you can kind of see the geographic loci of transmission kind of moving around over time. And we know that this reflects, not just kind of geographic patterns of spread, but sort of social heterogeneity throughout the state. So when we break this down, looking in terms of these race ethnic categories, we see that during those initial months of the pandemic, from like March to the end of June of 2020, there were just absolutely enormous disparities in both incidence and mortality from COVID-19 in Michigan, with African Americans bearing the largest brunt of infection and death during this period. So the table you see on the slide shows an incidence rate ratio for Blacks as compared to whites of nearly 6, and a mortality rate ratio for Blacks as compared to whites of nearly 7, right? So this is just tremendous, tremendous disparities. And one way we can start to get our arms around them is to start digging into the distribution of cases and deaths by age. Particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, we know that mortality rates were just absolutely astronomical among older people. And before we kind of progress in our clinical management of the condition. And so what you can see on this slide are incidence rate ratios for Blacks, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Latinos as compared to whites. And the thing that I want to really draw your attention to here is this incredibly high disparity in incidence among older Blacks as compared to whites. And of course, this is the group of people who were, in terms of age, who are most susceptible to dying and having severe COVID-19 illness. And so at this time, when we started to see these disparities exploding, one of the big questions was whether they were a function of so-called pre-existing conditions, things like obesity, diabetes, and so forth, or whether they were a function of exposure, which might implicate things like occupational and residential segregation, disparities in access to healthcare, and so forth. So with access to these detailed data, we were able to dig in and look at this question. And when we broke down the case fatality rates by age and by race ethnic group, which you can see on this slide, there were very small differences between groups. It really didn't make much of a difference, once you got COVID-19. And so this started to say to us that perhaps this was the thing that was driving these tremendous disparities was exposure, right? At the household level, in the community, in healthcare settings, and so forth, and not so much this kind of narrative of pre-existing conditions, which had kind of come to dominate a lot of the conversation around disparities. So to kind of get our arms around this, right, we can kind of eyeball these figures and say, well, it looks like, clearly like it's incidence and not case fatality. But sometimes when you have access to the data, you have access to these models, you can use them to perform kind of thought experiments, right? So what we did here was we substituted the white incidence rates, the rates of infection for those among African Americans in Michigan. And we saw that just substituting that, but keeping the case fatality rates fixed, we would see roughly an 83% decrease in mortality among Blacks in Michigan. So this is just, to me, this is kind of a staggering, if not very surprising result that shows you the role of the kind of occupational and residential segregation in inflating these disparities. So, just to give a quick rundown here, what might explain some of these disparities in exposure? First, the prevalence of essential work among non-whites and lower income individuals has been demonstrated to really be a driver of disparities in Michigan and elsewhere using things like cell phone mobility data. Multi-generational households and household crowding, much of which is the aftermath of the housing crisis in 2008, which is still with us in many ways and disproportionately affected Black and brown people, particularly in Michigan. Mass incarceration, we know there have been many outbreaks in jails and prisons in Michigan and beyond. And when we think of a term like racial residential segregation, which is kind of a catch-all, I think it really encompasses these and other factors. Okay, so that's this is sort of in the first months of the pandemic. Now I'm going to kind of move to this period, when we were kind of moving out of that first acute wave, which we perhaps somewhat naively thought was the worst of it, and now looking into the period from July until the present. And most of the results that I'm going to talk about here come from the work of Ramya Narhar-Sethi, who's a doctoral student in my group, who's been looking at these questions of change over time. So on the slide, you can see this great timeline that folks have put together that's available on COVID mapping as well, which shows you kind of the progression of the pandemic and its relationship to different events in the course of the pandemic. So we see that those early months of April, May, June, July were perhaps not the worst as it happened, and that there was a lot of change in terms of incidence over the summer and going into the fall, and certainly into the latest variant field wave that we've just been living through. And by the end of the summer of 2020, it actually looked like some of these race and ethnic disparities that were so huge in the spring were decreasing. And so on the face of it, that seems like good news, but when we go back and we look at the timeline here, we do see that the rates across the board are going up. So, anybody who's paying critical attention might kind of scratch their head and say, this doesn't seem to be a reflection of positive change. And indeed, it kind of wasn't. So this is a nice figure that Ramya and Nina Masters put together, showing change in the white incidence rate versus the African-American rate and the Latino rate through 2020. And what you can see is that over the summer, the incidence rate among whites increased dramatically. And a lot of that change in that ratio comes from the worsening of the overall pandemic rather than a decline in the objective conditions that led to these disparities in the beginning. And also we see that the landscape has really shifted. And this is something we see going through 2021, which is that Latinos in Michigan are now experiencing, a very high burden of infection and a high, relatively high ratio as compared to whites. So, when we think about disparities, we have to be very careful not to just kind of focus again in this kind of race ethnic lens, because, it can easily, the loci of that can easily move, because what we're really looking at is kind of the residue of discrimination and power differentials. So, despite the fact that case fatality rates did decline across the board over the course of the pandemic, which you can see on this slide, which I think does a very nice job of illustrating it, Black people in Michigan still suffered the greatest death toll in 2020 by a factor of about 3. So ultimately, despite these ostensible improvements, many of which were real improvements, incidence rates for many groups did go down. Those rate ratios, whether we trust them or not as an indicator of disparity, did go down. Case fatality rates went down, but ultimately you can't unbake this cake. You can't run time backwards and bring back the people who died at the beginning of the pandemic. So, what I want to leave you with as we get down to the end here is that in a pandemic with an emerging infection, when you get infected really is a life and death matter. Right? The longer you're able to wait to get infected, the less likely you were to die from COVID-19. While incidence rates increased dramatically, case fatality rates fell. So people like me who've been working from their extra bedroom since March of 2020 and could kind of wait it out and keep their kids at home and so forth, were able to kind of take the time to stay out of harm's way while the clinical management of infection got better, while vaccines were being developed and so forth. And obviously this ability to wait it out is a function of income and residential and occupational segregation and racial discrimination. So I want to leave you with another thought experiment that comes from the work that Ramya is doing. So imagine that Michiganders from all race and ethnic groups were able to be infected at the same pace as whites. So the same overall burden, but you got to wait longer. So it's just kind of equalize the tempo of infection between all of these groups, and see how that ability to just kind of ride it out might have decreased the death toll. And when we do that, we see that having an equal opportunity to wait out the pandemic could have reduced Black mortality by more than 30%, right? So just not even changing the conditions that are necessarily getting people exposed, but giving them the time to just wait to get infected by being out of the workplace, by not being compelled into essential or precarious work, by not living in the kind of conditions that put people at those kinds of risks to be at the front of the line to get infected, really could have made an enormous difference. So as I wind up, I just want to think about what happens next time, right? We might like to think that this is a once in a lifetime event, and I certainly hope that it is. But I think what we've learned is that equity really has to be really front and center in our preparedness for the next event, right? And so one thing that we've learned is that it takes time to understand and manage the transmission and clinical aspects of an emerging infection like SARS-CoV-2. And whatever comes down the pipe the next time, we're going to have to undergo a similar kind of learning experience. When we have the kind of chaotic and reactive response that we've had, we see massive inequality. It's pretty much guaranteed because people who have less power are pushed to the front of the line, and those who have enough to kind of stay home and stay out of harm's way will. And so again, we need to think about preparedness, think about modeling in a way that puts equity at the center and doesn't say this is a thing we think about, kind of outside of the box of biology, right? Really, these two things can only make sense in concert with each other, particularly when we're talking about a communicable disease like this. And when we change our lens a bit to model these kind of socioeconomic and racial disparities in terms of power rather than race and ethnic categories, I think this is a direction we're going to need to go in to make them actually addressable by policy and direct action. And so that's a kind of reimagining of some of this stuff that we're trying to do right now as we kind of hopefully kind of get out of what we might think of as the acute or sort of wartime phase of the pandemic and are kind of making plans for the future, and preparing for the next event, whatever it might be. So I'll pause there, but I will just say if you're interested in learning more, you can access an interactive tutorial getting at some of these mechanisms at this link. It's also available on our website, which is epibase.io, which is, I think is linked in my bio. And so at that, I just want to say thanks for your time and for paying attention. And thanks, of course, to the team of folks who made all this possible.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jon. That was really insightful and interesting.